Thanks so much for logging on. The title of our symposium is A Continuum of Technology Use in Parent-Mediated Interventions. Today we'll have 4 presentations as part of the symposium. We'll start with Brittany St. John, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, followed by Ann Hoffmann, who is an assistant professor at Rush University. Anna Wallisch will go next. Anna is a postdoctoral researcher at Juniper Gardens Children's Project at University of Kansas. And then I'll go last. I'm currently an associate professor in occupational therapy at Rush University. Our discussant is Dr. Brian Boyd, who is the director and associate professor at Juniper Gardens Children's Project at University of Kansas. The 4 presentations that we'll cover today. First, Brittany St. John will talk about a need for more technology. So just as a little background, we did put this symposium together prior to COVID-19, really thinking about how technology can support parents' self-efficacy in parent-mediated interventions. And so Brittany St. John will describe an evaluation of a parent-mediated mealtime behavior intervention for young children with autism. Her presentation focuses on how parents reported that more involvement of technology would be effective in the delivery of the intervention. The second presentation serves as an example of technology embedded within an intervention. So Ann Hoffmann will talk about how parents are using speech generating devices for young children with Fragile X. The third presentation demonstrates how technology can be used to both deliver a parent-mediated intervention via telehealth, as well as how parent outcomes may be continuously evaluated using ecological momentary assessment gathered via text messaging. And the fourth presentation demonstrates the feasibility and preliminary efficacy of providing access to technology and internet among under-resourced families to access a coaching intervention. This last presentation was put together post-COVID-19. In this symposium, we positioned each presentation to show how technology may be used across the continuum from the least intrusive to the most vital method of implementing that intervention. So I'm excited about our speakers. I'm excited about this symposium, and thank you so much for listening.
I'm Brittany St. John, a PhD candidate in occupational science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I work with Dr. Carla Osterau. Today, I'm presenting the results from our pilot study of a parent-mediated in-home feeding intervention for children with autism and feeding challenges. Children with ASD experience high rates of heterogeneous feeding challenges. These challenges are shaped by mealtime expectations, family context, and culture, and can impact child nutrition and health. In addition to concerns related to nutrition and health of the child, feeding challenges can have cascading effects that disrupt family cohesion and parent-child interactions. Parent-mediated interventions offer an ecologically valid approach that have demonstrated success targeting a wide variety of functional skills for children with autism. The purpose of this study was to assess the feasibility and effectiveness of an in-home parent-mediated feeding intervention for families with children with autism. We enrolled 16 parent-child dyads, and 14 of them were able to complete the study. Our intervention used a combination of parent training, coaching, and direct intervention. Families participated in 24 weekly intervention visits focused on parent coaching and direct intervention in combination. In addition, parents received 7 parent training modules covering specific feeding-related topics. Between weekly intervention visits, parents completed tracking of weekly strategies and documented any questions they had that came up for them during the week. Goal attainment scaling was our primary outcome, and we collected a number of pre-post measures aimed at capturing child characteristics, parenting stress, and mealtime context. This table summarizes the participants in this phase of the study. On average, they were just under 5 years old and scored in the moderate severity range on the SRS. Our gender distribution is close to the prevalence observed in the population of children with autism, and our racial ethnicity distribution is close to the distribution of the state of Wisconsin. Our sample was skewed high for both household income and parental education. Our primary outcome measure, goal attainment scaling, is a well-validated and reliable assessment tool for measuring individualized goals. We use the standardized format for creating and measuring goals specific to each family. Goal attainment scaling was particularly applicable in this study because it allowed us to assess goals that were reflective of the heterogeneity observed in feeding challenges and family context. Although goals were unique to each family, they fell into target categories representing a range of common feeding intervention targets. Our two leading goal areas were mealtime behaviors and expanding a child's repertoire of foods. Additional goal areas focused on a child's approach to or exploration of food, their self-help skills, nutritional concerns, oral motor skills, and sensory regulation. We encouraged families to set functional goals around feeding and mealtime. For example, a common goal was focused on mealtime behavior was to engage in the mealtime at the table with a family a number of times per week on average. A food repertoire focused goal would target the child eating a child-sized portion of a number of new foods consistently by the end of the intervention. We were particularly pleased and surprised at how well families were able to meet and exceed their goals. The mean GAST score was 61.8 and demonstrated effective goal attainment. 12 of the 14 families met or exceeded their goals, while 2 of the families had goal achievement that was just lower than their set expected outcome. We also ran a one-sample t-test to evaluate whether the participants' mean of 61.8 was significantly higher than the accepted GAST score mean of 50. This test was significant with a large effect size, indicating that families significantly exceeded their expected outcomes on goals. The purpose of this pilot study was really to establish initial effectiveness of this intervention and allow for intervention modification moving into the second phase. We were really happy with the results of the pilot study and began actively enrolling families. Phase 2 was initiated in January of 2020 with 3 families enrolling and several beginning to enroll. In response to COVID-19, we made a rapid shift from an in-home intervention model to a telehealth intervention model and paused all recruitment efforts. In addition to complete telehealth intervention delivery, we developed a protocol for completing virtual intake visits, and this shift allowed us to expand our recruitment geographically, enrolling families from all over the state of Wisconsin. We have a current sample of 16 dyads enrolled and are recruiting up to 25 to start before May. Our currently enrolled sample is presenting with some unique characteristics, likely due to our expanded recruitment into communities without any feeding therapy and many with few or no autism services. The sample is 44% female, and many of them have complex medical conditions in addition to autism and feeding challenges. For example, structural palate malformations, frequent hospitalizations, significant illness, and G-tube placements. We are including a number of new measures to capture important variables in Phase 2. After reviewing data from 2 families who were unable to complete Phase 1 of the study, we believe that there were unique family characteristics that impacted their ability to complete the study, such as a high level of household chaos or inconsistency and unstable family routines. In addition, during exit interviews, parents commented on their perceived changes in their own skill sets for navigating feeding challenges, shifts in their approach to and expectations for mealtime, and reductions in their overall stress level. Measures of parenting self-efficacy and routine are aimed at capturing some of these changes. We are hopeful that these new measures will capture important family context characteristics and may inform considerations on parent readiness for participation in parent-mediated interventions moving forward. We are also adding objective measures of stress, including hair cortisol and heart rate variability, to more accurately measure the pre-post changes in parent stress. Overall, parents shared a high level of satisfaction with the intervention during their exit interviews. Parents requested a few simple adjustments that we are integrating into Phase 2. These changes included regular reminders for weekly intervention strategies via text and email, and expanded options for the format of parent training modules, including video presentations. Many parents shared how they experienced benefits from the intervention that impacted their own well being. Outside of qualitative interviews, this outcome wasn't captured in the pilot study. We wanted to highlight the unique ability of a parent mediated intervention to focus on both child and parent goals. In the second phase, we're including an additional parent training module on parent and family well being. This module focuses on the complexity of mealtime and how feeding challenges and parent and family well being can be closely related. At the end of the module, parents identify a parent focused goal that aims to improve their well being, broadly defined, and we will use goal attainment scaling to measure this outcome for parents. We are looking forward to completing this second phase and expanding our assessment of intervention effectiveness. Thank you to our participant families, to Dr. Osterau for this opportunity to run this study, for graduate students and undergraduate students past and present who contributed to the progress, and for our generous funders, the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Hoffmann from Rush University in Chicago, and today I'm going to be talking about the effects of a caregiver responsivity training on caregiver use of speech-generating devices with young children with Fragile X syndrome. So I want to thank Andy McDuffie, who helped me put this together, but is not here today. Fragile X syndrome is a developmental disorder that results from a mutation in the FMR1 gene on the X chromosome. So some overall characteristics are that males are typically more affected than females. There's a high rate of intellectual disability, as well as an increased rate of autism diagnosis. And what's most important for our discussion today is that there is often a language delay. Because of this language delay, many individuals with Fragile X syndrome remain minimally verbal far later than what is seen in typical language development. And because of this, augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, is a frequent recommendation. And so AAC just refers to any method of communicating that is outside of the speech signal. So either in addition to verbal communication or in place of verbal communication. There are two broad categories of AAC. Unaided, which means that nothing outside of the body is used to supplement or replace verbal communication, or aided, where something else is used, again, to supplement or replace verbal communication. For the study that we're discussing today, we targeted high-tech aided AAC. And what that means is that speech-generating devices were used to supplement or replace verbal communication for these children with Fragile X syndrome. And more specifically, we had the more complex speech-generating devices with multiple outputs possible. Given that we are looking at both caregiver responsivity and speech-generating device use, I do want to clarify briefly what we're looking for in those areas. So we wanted to see caregiver responsivity as manifested by contingent responses to child communication. So frequently this would be clarification or expansion of what the child is communicating and having a focus on child-led interactions. And then the speech-generating device being used for both input and output. So for this current study, we were drawing from a larger clinical trial that was pairing a caregiver responsivity training with a novel pharmaceutical. And so the inclusionary criteria for the larger trial was that the child with Fragile X syndrome needed to be between 30 months and 6 years, 11 months. The English was the primary language, and they had to use at least 3 intentional communication acts during a 25-minute communication sample. For this study, we also added that the child needed to rely primarily on a speech-generating device for their communication. The language intervention focused on increasing caregiver responsivity through a 4-month intensive language intervention that was delivered by trained speech-language pathologists via Skype. This included monthly parent education sessions where specific skills were taught, and then weekly coaching sessions where the SLPs interacted with the caregiver while they were playing with their child. And then the caregiver would complete homework sessions independently, attempting to use the skills taught, and the SLP would then provide feedback on those homework sessions. For coding, we looked only at homework sessions to see what caregivers were doing independently. The sessions had to have adequate audio for coding. The speech generating device had to be available for use throughout the session. And we pulled from these sessions: 1st, 4th, 8th, 11th, and 14th, plus or minus 1. The coding scheme we used came from the Responsive, Alternative, and Augmentative Communication Style Scale, 3rd edition, and this codes a variety of caregiver behaviors each minute for 10 minutes on a scale of 0, where the behavior is absent, to 2, where it's often present. And we chose 2 behaviors from the larger set, in that first, caregiver expands and clarifies their own communication, and caregiver expands and clarifies the child's communication. And then we also scored those 2 behaviors for whether the caregiver incorporated the speech generating device when using that behavior. Now I'm going to show just a brief example of what we were looking for during the homework sessions.
Eric, come here. What are we going to eat? Come sit. Come here.
Come. All places. Play with Mom.
Come in. Come in. Eric, come here. What are we going to eat? Come sit. Come here.
Come. All places. Play with Mom.
Come in.
So there you
Eric, come here.
could see that the caregiver was using the speech generating device to expand on her own communication. Okay, so that would be an example of that behavior.
Eric, come here.
We had 4 different caregiver-child dyads for this study. For the children, the age range was from just over 3.5 to 6.5. Each of the children were male, and as you can see, the receptive language and expressive language were below age expectations, as was the cognitive ability. On this slide, you can see how caregivers were rated for their responsivity in supplementing their own communication and supplementing their child's communication across the different homework sessions available for analysis. In these charts, you can see that caregivers were rated as being significantly more consistent at supplementing their own communication than they were supplementing their child's communication. And this was seen in each of the different dyads that we analyzed. These graphs show how often the caregivers used a speech-generating device to supplement either their communication or their child's communication. So in each minute that was coded, it was also marked if the caregiver used a speech-generating device and for which purpose they used it. And during these analyses, we saw that caregivers were once again more likely to use a speech-generating device when supplementing their own communication than they were their child's communication. And this was also significant at the 0.001 level. So when we were looking at responsivity and the use of a speech-generating device, one of the questions that came to mind was whether there was a correlation between how responsive a caregiver was and their use of a speech-generating device. And so we first examined if there was a correlation between how often a caregiver clarified or expanded their own utterance and their use of a speech-generating device to do so. And there was not. But when we examined the frequency of caregiver clarification and expansion of a child's utterance and their use of a speech-generating device, there was a correlation indicating that those caregivers who were more frequently responding and by supplementing their child's utterances, they were also more likely to use a speech-generating device to do so. Conclusions from this initial analysis of these data are that caregivers are more likely to clarify and expand their own utterances than those of their child, that caregivers are more likely to use a speech-generating device to clarify their own utterances than those of their child, and that for child utterances, there was a significant correlation between increased expansion of utterances and increased use of the speech-generating device by their caregiver. I want to say thank you to the support that made this project possible, the Fragile X Learn sites and the associated researchers, staff, and speech-language pathologists, and as always, and most importantly, our amazing families and participants.
Thank you all so much for being here and listening to this presentation. I wanted to preface by saying that this data that I'm going to be talking about was collected prior to COVID-19. And I think over the last year, we've all learned a lot about telehealth and hopefully a lot about ecological momentary assessment. So I'm hoping that this will lend itself to a nice discussion at the end of this presentation. So this project is on the feasibility of ecological momentary assessment during a telehealth intervention for families of children with autism. Due to provider shortages, families often are facing barriers in accessing services, and this is especially true for families living in rural areas, as well as families living in areas with service deserts. As we all know, telehealth has substantially grown in usage, and there was actually a fairly recent review that was suggesting that some telehealth interventions for children with autism are showing similar rates of efficacy compared to in-person interventions. Research is also suggesting that telehealth reduces the time, travel, and cost burdens that are often associated with in-person models. One of the models and types of interventions that's often used in telehealth service delivery is a coaching framework. And coaching has demonstrated that it has positive influences on child outcomes as well as parent outcomes like parent self-efficacy and parent stress. The Division of Early Childhood has also indicated that coaching is a best practice, and parent-mediated interventions are also considered an evidence-based practice for children with autism. While there is increasing evidence related to telehealth, I think that one of the things we are really finding issues with is how to track and how to measure parent outcomes via a telehealth intervention. And I think that this is particularly true for interventions that have no in-person contact, which is the situation many of us found ourselves in over the last year. For child outcomes, we can typically use video observations to then code child behaviors, but we can't do this with non-observable behaviors like parent self-efficacy and stress. So we're often relying on parent report measures at pre and post intervention, but then these are relying on parent recall. So we need better tools to measure more incremental change. So in putting this all together, ecological momentary assessment is a novel method that may help to measure changes in parent factors that occur in real time, as well as support current ways of measuring outcomes in telehealth. The aims of this study are to evaluate the feasibility of using ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, to measure parental self-efficacy and stress over a 9-session telehealth occupation-based coaching intervention, as well as to explore the extent to which the short-term intervention influenced changes in parental self-efficacy and stress as measured by EMA. We recruited families with a young child with autism between the ages of 2 to 6 years, and we enrolled 9 families and 7 families completed the intervention. The 2 families who did not complete the intervention indicated they felt they didn't have enough time. Parents received 9 sessions of occupation-based coaching across 9 to 12 weeks, and occupation-based coaching pulls from both positive psychology and early childhood coaching described by Rush and Sheldon. Occupation-based coaching utilizes both family and child strengths to collaborate with families and develop solutions. And it utilizes these 5 core components: authentic context, family routines and interests. It promotes caregiver interactions. It uses reflective, open-ended questions to promote caregiver reflection and feedback. And it also concludes the sessions with a joint plan. At the time of enrollment, parents received information on EMA survey links and how to navigate the survey. Families were also offered the choice to receive the survey via text or email, but all families chose to receive it via email. And since parent stress and self-efficacy are not triggered by specific predetermined events, we sent EMA bids once a week at random times between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. And parents responded to 3 domains of questions, which included parent self-efficacy from the parent sense of competence scale, parent stress from the parent stress scale, and general stress from the perceived stress scale. And if a parent didn't respond to the survey within 24 hours, a follow-up reminder was sent. For our first research question, which is evaluating the feasibility of using EMA, we calculated the percentage of response rates for each survey attempt and the amount of time it took for parents to respond to the survey. And since we collected data from March 2018 to August 2018, we used ANOVA to understand if month influenced response time or response rates. And for our second research question, we used mixed model regression, and we tested 3 models. 1 model with parental self-efficacy, 1 model with parenting stress, and 1 model with general stress. We treated the EMA responses as repeated measures and included time as an independent variable. Results suggested that participants completed 78.5% of EMA data collection, and a total of 12 follow-up reminders were sent, with 25% of these reminders receiving responses. It took a median of 47 minutes for parents to respond to the survey, and there were no significant differences in responses by month data was collected. And then results of the mixed model regression with using week 8 or post-intervention data as the reference category. Results showed that from week 1 to week 8, there were significant differences for self-efficacy and parent stress, but there were not significant differences for general stress. And when looking at a visual representation of this data, we see here in this solid line, parent self-efficacy, which shows a nice linear and upward trajectory. It shows kind of a little bit more variability at the beginning. And then for this dotted line, which is parent stress, we see a lot of variability, but a downward trajectory from week 1 to week 8. I think what's interesting to note here, and when looking at this, is that week 5, we see this dip in parent self-efficacy, and we see this really heightened parent stress. But then after this week 5, we see this really nice steady increase in parent self-efficacy and still variable, but a general decrease in parent stress. So what does this all mean? It means that EMA may be a feasible way to gather data on outcomes from a coaching via telehealth intervention, since parents often responded to the EMA bids. Parents did show a decrease in parent stress, but not general stress, although the parenting stress was highly variable, as we saw in the graph. And parents showed an increase in parent self-efficacy, and after that 5th session, they appeared to show a more steady increase in self-efficacy. So future directions, there are studies that suggest parent factors like self-efficacy and stress may mediate child outcomes, and future studies should investigate the usage of EMA to understand the fluctuations of parent outcomes and how those relate to fluctuations in child outcomes over the course of an intervention. Future research should also investigate the relationship between the trajectories of parent self-efficacy and parent stress over the course of an intervention. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Lauren Little and Winnie Dunn, as well as the families who participated in this study. Thanks so much for listening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for logging on. Today, I'd like to tell you about a telehealth intervention to address early intervention access disparities. So as you all know, early intervention services such as occupational and speech therapies positively influence children's developmental trajectories, reduce parent stress, and result in decreased special education costs throughout the lifespan. However, research suggests that there are clear disparities in access and utilization of early intervention services that are influenced by race, ethnicity, and family location. So during COVID-19, all in-person EI services across the country were suspended, and EI systems had to make that rapid shift to telehealth service delivery. That shift to telehealth service delivery has exacerbated the disparities in EI service provision and utilization, particularly among under-resourced families due to a lack of technology, a lack of internet access, or sufficient data and trained providers. So the purpose of this study was really to evaluate the feasibility and acceptability of a coaching intervention where we provided technology and internet to families of children that qualified for EI but were on wait lists or experienced service delay due to the lack of technology or internet access during COVID-19. The intervention model that we wanted to test in this sample mirrored the model that should have been occurring by community-based clinicians as well, and that's early childhood coaching. So this draws from the Russian Sheldon model, where they use everyday context, families' interests and routines, really support caregiver interaction and responsiveness, and then invite the caregiver to reflect on their interactions with their children. The provider gives feedback, and then at the end of every session, the provider and the parent come up with a joint plan where the parent is going to implement specific strategies throughout the week. We wanted to test the model where we would meet with parents 2 times a week, 30 minutes, so a total of 60 minutes over the course of 12 weeks. For this study, we did offer parents a Samsung Galaxy tablet with a Verizon hotspot with unlimited data per month. The total per family for 12 months for both the tablet and the hotspot was $910. We also drew from Tickle Degnan's 2013 work that outlined the nuts and bolts of components of feasibility. So we wanted to look at process, resources, and the scientific basis of engaging under-resourced families, particularly on the west side of Chicago, to understand those elements of feasibility that would be necessary to translate into a larger trial. We administered the coronavirus impact scale in this sample, and we also implemented the telehealth acceptability questionnaire. So we are still enrolling parents, and we are in the midst of data collection. So far, we have 16 families. Children present with a range of diagnoses, including developmental delay and genetic syndromes. 5 out of the 16 children identify as Black, 11 out of the 16 are white, 6 out of the 16 identify as Hispanic, and then 40% of the families enrolled have an income less than $20,000 a year. So while we are still collecting and analyzing data, I wanted to share some of our lessons learned because we've definitely had some bumps along the way in this project. So we have had 74.6% of enrollment, and that means about a quarter of the families that we're initially screening. And then when we send out the enrollment packet, a quarter of them were not getting the packet back. We have learned from families that there are consent form difficulties. So from a process standpoint, we have a 9-page consent form. And we have had families call when they receive the packet and say, what exactly am I signing up for? And so we think that there's some issues related to that consent form. And we are trying to work with the IRB. And I'm open to any suggestions as well to try to figure out how we can address that with families. Also, from a process standpoint, we have had 30% of sessions with a last-minute cancellation, so directly before the session, or no-shows. And then from the resource standpoint, the type and availability of technology to order during COVID has greatly varied. So we started this project thinking we are going to offer families Chromebooks, but there were no Chromebooks available due to the time that we started and schools were starting remote. So all the Chromebooks were gone. There's also a need for supporting families to troubleshoot technology consistently throughout the intervention. So while we anticipated to support families at the beginning of the intervention to set up the hotspot and set up the tablet, that hasn't been quite enough. So there needs to be that consistent support along the way for when they experience difficulty. And then also one of the things is that we really need to consider digital literacy, potentially including measures at baseline as well as even post intervention to understand how even kind of response to a telehealth intervention like this is dependent on a parent's digital literacy. The scientific basis for this, so what we know about a larger trial, the parents reported that 2 times a week, the burden was too high. They asked to only meet one time a week because of scheduling difficulties, et cetera. And then we have found that when families are provided the tablet and the internet, they're starting their other therapy services that were written on their IFSP, which is wonderful. And so we're also engaging in a potential cost analysis to try to understand how that $910 can really even result in cost effectiveness when families can then access, our families on average now, the 3 services a week. So a couple quick discussion points. We are wondering if a byproduct of a telehealth intervention for under-resourced families is digital literacy. So tracking that over time. It could also be the impact of COVID as well, just so much reliance on technology. And then we're really thinking about recruitment methods. So we cannot recruit online, and we're having to do a lot with paper and a lot on the phone. Interventionist flexibility and family collaboration is key. These are families that often report that they do not feel a lot of collaboration with their providers. And so that coaching framework may be vital in setting the stage for that family collaboration. And then we've had to definitely schedule family sessions in the evenings, on the weekends, to match family scheduling issues. So then lastly, with regard to policy considerations, if telehealth is going to be an EI system-wide approach to stay, then there has to be some elements in place to support families to access telehealth interventions, whether that's tablet programs, internet programs, because if telehealth interventions are supposed to decrease access disparities, we need those supports in place from what we've learned about what it takes to support families with regard to digital literacy, with regard to providing the tablet and the internet. Thank you so much to the families that have participated. Thank you from the funding from Rush Translational Science Consortium, our research assistants, and then we've collaborated with the Child and Family Connections Centers of Early Intervention in Illinois for this. So I look forward to hopefully sharing our full data set with all of the analyses once we get all that collected and analyzed. Thanks so much for listening.
Hello, I'm Brian Boyd from the University of Kansas, and once again, we've been able to hear from a wonderful group of presenters at the Gatlinburg Conference, and so I'm privileged to be able to be a discussant for this panel on what is definitely a hot topic, in particular in the midst of a pandemic, and that is a continuum of technology use. And certainly, within the field of IDD and autism, we've been thinking more and more around parent-mediated interventions, and there's so many of those. So how do we infuse these 2 issues, both the use of technology, but then how can we use technology within the context of our interventions? So I'm going to share some thoughts around the presentations we've heard today, and sort of some of my take-home points as I listened to them and reviewed the presentations. So a couple of initial thoughts. I mean, certainly the pandemic has increased the need for technological solutions, right? As we've sort of had to rethink how we meet with others, how we socially connect with others, how we have conferences, and definitely within the context of disabilities, how we provide services to families and children. So certainly everything has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and the need for technological solutions is also one of those things. The other thing, though, that was already happening, before the pandemic, if we can remember life before the pandemic, is that technology was already quite ubiquitous and increasingly affordable, right? So we know from studies that even among families who are more socioeconomically disadvantaged, that they often have access to smartphones, at least. So the affordability of technology, the accessibility of technology really helps us think about how we can use it within the context of our research and treatment and service provision for families who have children with IDD or with individuals with IDD themselves. So those are sort of some general points, and then I'm going to talk about some of the things that I got out of the different papers that were presented as part of this panel. So first, I think Lauren Little's study really reminds us that yes, technology is increasingly available, but digital divides still exist. And the pandemic has also exacerbated those issues. That while families may have access to smartphones, they may not have access to all the technology and supports that are needed to support their children. And certainly we know that internet and Wi-Fi access, high-speed Wi-Fi access, is one of those issues where digital divides do still exist. And so as we think more about the use of technology within the context of our interventions, we're going to have to think about how we don't increase divides that exist, how we provide access to all and for all, that this does not become a source of inequity in service provision. The Hoffmann and Little study, though, also pointed out that even when we provide technology, that parents and caregivers may require or may need support and training to actually use it as intended. So what are the best supports for parents and caregivers? What are the best practices for supporting them in their use of technology as they try to work with their children who have IDD, and as they're trying to support their outcomes, right? As parents are trying to support the outcomes of their children with disabilities, how do we best support parents? How do we train them in this technology? We're going to have to think more about this as we begin to use technology more. The Brittany St. John and Anna Wallisch studies really showed us, though, that parents and caregivers are interested, and that is fantastic, right? They're interested in using technology and willing to do so. But again, we have to think about how to best support them in their use of it. I think the other thing that these papers really did successfully show, as was in the title, is that there really is a continuum of use, that technology can serve multiple purposes and functions, from that of assessment, in the case of using it for EMA data collection, all the way to support intervention implementation. And so we can certainly build off of that. But again, it does raise some questions for us, right? So what are our best practices for use in assessment versus intervention implementation? How do we deal with issues of continuous changes and updates to technology? How do we best support parents and caregivers to use technology? How do we best support individuals with disabilities to use technology? And how do we address the growing digital divide with access to technology? So I think this panel really helps us think about some things and helps us engage in discussion around these very important issues that the field will continue to grapple with and address, because certainly technology isn't going away, although hopefully the pandemic, I think, is, but technology isn't. And we see that families want to use it, are interested in use it. And so we're going to have to think more about how we help them successfully use it. So thank you, and I'm so glad you decided to listen into this panel.